Janet McMahon is an ecologist who lives in Maine here with me. Janet works with land trusts, conservation organizations, government agencies, and private landowners to identify, understand, and design landscape-scale conservation areas. She has prepared ecological assessments and regional conservation plans for the Madomic, Sheepscot, and St. John River watersheds, the Blue Hill Peninsula, the Great Pond Mountain region, the Western Maine Mountains, and most recently, the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. Janet studied biology and geology at Colby College and has a master's degree in plant ecology from the University of Maine. Her thesis and map, The Biophysical Regions of Maine, is used as a framework for many landscape scale conservation efforts in Maine. And her report, An Ecological Reserves System for Maine, Benchmarks in a Changing Landscape, provided a blueprint for a statewide ecological reserve system and led to ecological reserves legislation in 2000. Janet served on the Maine Forest Sustainability Council, the Allagash Wilderness Waterway Advisory Council, and I'll pause here and say that I was also a member of that very first Allagash Wilderness Waterway Advisory Council, which is where I probably bumped into you, Janet, a couple times before then, but that's really where I came to understand your work a heck of a lot better. Janet has also served with the Maine Conservation Task Force and currently serves on the Maine Ecological Reserves Scientific Advisory Committee. She's actively involved with Maine's land trust communities and with First Light, which seeks to expand Wabanaki access to land, enhance land and water stewardship and return, and create a stronger conservation movement that includes and reflects Indigenous expertise and perspectives. And the last thing I'll add is that it's been my great pleasure currently serving as the president of the Allagash Wilderness Waterway Foundation, which you can think of as the Friends Group for the Allagash. Our group decided about 5 years ago that shortly after the waterway was celebrating its 50th anniversary, that an ecological assessment had never been done. And these days, it's the first thing that's done when you establish a public unit of recreation or conservation or whatever. The first thing you do is an ecological assessment. So we drew up a rough plan and approached Janet, and she came back with a very detailed proposal for how to achieve the goal. And I think with that, I'll stop sharing and give the floor to Janet. Welcome, Janet, to the New England Botanical Society.
Thank you, Don. That was quite an introduction. I don't think I've ever had such an introduction. That's why I just say I'm an ecologist, but I appreciate that. So I'm going to try sharing my screen, which for some reason, we'll see if that will work here. And jump right in. Okay, so hopefully we're good. And everyone can hear me. Okay, good. All right, so this, I'll just start by saying, was probably the hardest and the most amazing job I've ever had, or work I've ever done. It was like a dream job, but it just kept sort of building on itself. And when you're studying an entire river watershed, that's a lot of information to take in. So I'm going to try to summarize some of what we did and why and how, some key findings and recommendations. So as Don said, the foundation hired me to prepare an ecological assessment of the watershed, and it's ended in a report. This is the report, and also a series of maps that go with it. And the purpose was to protect the ecological integrity of the waterway, to figure out, what's at risk and how best to ensure that it stay the amazing resource it is. And as he mentioned, a baseline had never been done, so to establish that. I also looked at some future climate scenarios in that part of the state. and then identifying management issues and highlighting conservation needs within the watershed. And then one final piece is turning this into something that can be more of a layperson's guide as well, a handbook you could carry along when you're traveling along the waterway. So the Wilderness Waterway, I don't know how many of you've been there. I wish I could see your faces, but it's a 92 mile, actually it's more like 100 mile if you start from one of the lakes that people don't usually start in, but a system of lakes and rivers running from south to north. It's just a tiny little strip. You can barely see the strip of green along the river, only 500 feet wide on either side, and adds up to about 25,000 acres over the course of almost 100 miles, and then about 33,000 acres of water. You can see those big lakes in the southern part. So it's amazing to me when I think about what an important resource with the amount of land that would equal basically one township in Maine, one of those green squares that you see. And I'll just mention those green squares and the other green blocks are land that are owned by the Bureau of Parks and Lands, which is who manages this waterway. And there are also some ecological reserves embedded within the waterway. So first, I'd like to just start with a big picture. Some of you may have seen, I guess, the Nature Conservancy uses this classification of the Northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion. The United States is divided into ecoregions. And this one's based basically on forest types and wetland types to some extent. But this is the largest and most intact temperate forest in North America, and many people think the world. And the Allagash within that blue circle lies in the heart of it. And it's about 1.1 million acres, which is the equivalent of about 45 Maine townships. And the part that's in purple is within the St. John watershed, which is next to the St. Lawrence, the largest watershed on the East Coast. And then about 15% of it, the blue, flows into the east branch of the Penobscot. And in 1841, a dam was put in that actually reversed the flow of that southern part, used to flow into the Allagash. But we looked at both of those, and I'm calling that the Allagash River watershed, even though it actually drains in two directions. And 90% privately owned by 5 landowners, 5 commercial forest landowners, and then the Bureau of Parks and Lands owns some. And if you look in the right, this is something we didn't really realize, as I was doing this work, we just learned more and more, but it's in the largest undeveloped watershed and block of land east of the Rockies, and this is based on where public roads are. So it really stands out in the Northeast and in the Eastern United States. And from an ecological standpoint, it straddles the boundary between spruce fir northern hardwood forest ecosystem and the northern boreal forest. And as the climate shifts, it's becoming more and more just spruce fir northern hardwood forest, or there's still pockets that are more boreal. So I'm just going to briefly say how we did this, just so you have that background. And the first step was compiling everything we knew from what we have a program called the Maine Natural Areas Program. A lot of states have programs like that. So we used their information, our Fish and Wildlife Department information. I guess those were the 2 major sources, but any information we had on rare plants and animals, communities, stream segments, we put on a map and started there. And we looked not just within this 500-foot corridor along the river, but also within what's called the 1 mile zone along the river, and really the whole watershed. But some of that information is proprietary, so we didn't get all of it from the forest landowners. The next step was preparing very detailed base maps to take out in the field. And this is one of 16 maps that cover the length of the waterway. We started with topography. Then we used very detailed drainage, not just like a 20-foot contour that allowed us to see where tiny seeps and ephemeral streams were. We looked at soil types, and then we looked at both true color and infrared photography. And that helped us figure out where to go on the ground. And the field work was over the course of 2 May through September periods. That was done partly because there was just too much to do in one field season, but also to thinking that we probably have different conditions. And it turned out we did. 2021 was one of the drier years on record. and 2022 was very wet. So got to see conditions, the varied conditions over the growing season. So paddled a lot of miles, basically circumnavigated every lake and paddled the length of it, and also traveled into the interior, equivalent of 60 miles, spent 83 days in the field. And also, I did not do this, but 2 other people were installing stream temperature monitors, and we flew over the waterway in 3 flights. So I'm going to talk about some key findings, and I'm going to step back first, talking about some of the bigger things, so the bigger patterns, because I documented mostly things that the state agencies are interested in, natural communities, rare habitats, and plants and animals, streams that are important for cold water fish, that type of thing. But there's some bigger patterns that really weren't clear to me until I sort of stood back and looked at the whole thing. So I'm going to go over those. And I'm just backtracking. This is the type of information, again, that the state would track, and I'll just briefly summarize the general type. But natural communities are those pink polygons, and then there's rare plant locations and animal locations. Yellow streams are priority cold water fish habitat. There's heritage brook trout ponds, have those little blue fish symbols. That type of information is what the state is most interested in, and so we have a series of maps that includes all of that. But there's, I think, a lot of bigger things that are worth noting as well. And one is the logging history. I don't know how well on your screens you'll be able to see this, but I'm always intrigued by how resilient the waterway is, because not even 100 years ago, the river had depots, farms, a 600-acre farm on one of the lakes, to grow hay for horses and oxen, a school, many dams, a railroad over part of it, a tramway to get logs between 2 lakes. And all the black dots that you can see are different depots and structures or dams that existed along the waterway. So it was a totally different place. And in the 30s, it was harvested very heavily. But when you're there today, I'm just going to, if you look at you probably can't see it that well, but on the right-hand side, the 3rd photo down, is a place called Tramway Village, which is on Eagle Lake. And there was an Oniscod village there, and also a tramway to get logs to the lake to the south. And this is what it looks like today. The beaver lodge there, and the wetlands have come back. So if you're on the waterway, for those of you who've been there, it just feels, you think of it as sort of, calm, quiet, spacious, wild, and can hardly even imagine what it used to look like when it was in the sort of bustling log driving days. And this is just one example. There are some remains of those days. This was the old railroad that crossed over the outlet of one of the major streams. But for the most part, well, if you look, there's lots of rusty pieces of equipment tucked away in the woods. But for the most part, you just really almost have no idea that this happened only 100 years ago or less. And the other piece is it's an incredibly dynamic system, as any river system is. This is showing the Allagash Falls, which is quite a large waterfall downstream in the river during the fall, on the left, where the water level's really low, and then in the spring and April on the right, and you can see the difference in how much water passes through. And it has 3 dams on it, but they're managed to maintain relatively natural river flow, so it mimics the flows on the St. John, which is free flowing. So it does pretty much act like a natural river, and because of that, the amount of ice and water in the spring freshet that comes down this river completely shapes what you see, especially downstream. And this is one example. I was there just 2 weeks ago paddling the river, and the water levels range from a high of more than 80,000 cubic feet per second to about 80 cubic feet per second. And in this case, you have to walk the last 10 miles of river when it's below about 400 cubic feet, which it was 2 weeks ago. So it's just hugely variable, and constantly changing as a result. And then beavers, I am infatuated with beavers, because everywhere I look, especially as precipitation increases, I see the action of beavers. And on every tributary stream in the Allagash, the wetlands are constantly cycling back between ponds and excuse me, forests and sedge meadows. I've tried to get canoes. I did get mine up and over this and many others, but You really can't go anywhere without encountering the influence of beavers. They have a huge influence on the wetlands. So between the dynamics of just a natural hydrologic cycle and beavers, it's just always changing. And another thing I didn't really realize till looking at all the information is it's almost like three rivers in one. The southern part is characterized by lots of large lakes and some large peatlands. And then the middle part, there's all these big deltas because there's a number of large streams that come into slower water. And then the lower part is just very scoured shorelines from ice. There's just a lot of water and a lot of sediment deposited towards the mouth of the river. So it has three very different feels to it. And I'll give you some examples. This is one of the bogs in the southern part, the largest bog in that whole northwestern part of the state. And there's a number of peatlands that formed just because of clay deposits when the glaciers melted. And then there's a lot of large lakes. The largest is Chamberlain Lake, 16,000 acres, but there's about 150 ponds in the waterway, and most of them have, none of them have dams on them, and they're all natural at this point, although some of them used to. So quite a range in size. And then my favorite is Allagash Lake, which is about 5,000 acres, and it's the cleanest and least developed lake I have ever seen. I'm guessing probably the least disturbed in the state by the influence of people. The water's really clear, lots of freshwater mussels. Those mounds on the middle photograph in the bottom are fall fish nests. You can see them creeping up. That was a low water year, but that's a sign of really clean water. And then there's also, just teeming with wildlife. There's a type of gull called Bonaparte's gull that only nests in the Allagash on the lake in trees. Other than that, the nearest nesting site is in Ontario. It's the only place in Maine it nests, kind of a mystery. So there's just lots of cool, unusual things about this area. The middle portion, as I said, has lots of deltas, and some of them are quite large, like Champasak on the upper right, or Glacier Brook. They're so large that where they come together, the river, or there's some ponds, but it basically turns into a river channel because the deltas are blocking it. So this is, I think there's just a lot of sediment coming in and the water slows, so a lot of sediment is built up. And the wetland variety and number of species of both plants and birds and other wildlife is astounding in these areas. They're constantly shifting and just lots of varied vegetation. And then down below, you get these scoured shores just because the amount of ice and water keep any trees from growing. You can see that band of herbaceous vegetation and shrubs, but there's just too much energy moving through. The trees that do stand, you can see scour marks on the ice 5 to 10 feet up their trunks. And here again, this is below Allagash Falls that an earlier slide was showing, but below this, the river character changes. It's the water just pummels the shores. So a lot of the things we found, and it's a very brief summary, but we looked at all the existing information on mammals and reptiles, insects, invertebrates, and there's a lot of unusual things. The bedrock is, a lot of it's circumneutral, and so things like shrubby cinquefoil grow, and there's one of the few places in the world where one type of butterfly that needs shrubby cinquefoil is. There's also a bat hibernicula, one of 4, where brown bats winter, although they're suffering from the white nose syndrome. And lots of amphibians sort of reaching northern limits in the area. Canada lynx is thriving now in the Allagash and to the south, and moose are still thriving up there, although they've been impacted by the winter tick, which I can talk about if anyone wants to know more. One of the things that the Allagash is noted for is its cold water fish. It has 4 species. Brook trout is considered the last stronghold, or probably the most important area in the northeast or east of the Rockies for brook trout, but it also has lake trout, lake whitefish, and burbot, all species that like cold, clean water. And they all occur together, and this is the only place that we're aware of that happens. And for birds, the breeding bird atlas was being conducted in the same years that I was doing this work, and we took part in it to some extent, and then another one was done roughly 30 years ago. So it was an interesting way to compare what's changed in the area. But the Allagash is in the heart of about 25% of the largest globally important bird area in the country, and that's recognized by the National Audubon Society. And all of the northern song warblers in Maine are found in the watershed and are thought to be breeding. And there's a lot of other changes happening, which I'll talk about in a little while, but more than 100 species of birds are known to nest there. And we didn't do an exhaustive plant survey, just kept incidental sightings. And I also recorded what had been documented in through other surveys, but about 500 species are what we ended up with. And that is about a third of what we have in Maine. And I'm guessing there's at least a couple hundred more. I mean, I'm a reasonable botanist, but not a great botanist. And if we were to do systematic surveys, I think we'd come up with a lot more, which means it's probably one of the more diverse landscapes in the state, in part because of the diversity of wetland types. And it's an interesting contrast to Baxter State Park because there's so many wetlands along it compared to Baxter, which has a lot more upland species that are of interest. And we also documented 70 species of moss, a lot of sphagnums and other types. And again, a very cursory look at what's there, but a very diverse place. And for rare plants, most of them are associated with circumneutral bedrock, like below Allagash Falls and below, you'll see lots of outcrops like these. And bluebell was a good indicator of those. And there also tend to be more boreal species. And there were also rare 11 community types that are considered rare in Maine. I was most struck by the wetlands. About half of the actual waterway is wetland. And it's surprising, the condition is amazing. And there are some invasives, purple loosestrifes creeping into around some of the lakes. But in general, they're in amazingly pristine condition, especially given the logging activity. And they include a blend of northern and southern types, like the Ellis Bog, which is actually a ribbed fen, which reaches the southern limit in Maine. And then the Finley Bogan area below is a silver maple floodplain. And this is one of the northernmost examples in the country or in the eastern United States. And all those yellow trees are silver maples. And the shorelines are also incredibly varied. There's lots of lakeshore beaches like this one, which have their own suites of species, lots of rocky shore, and this really convoluted shore, cedar fens, cattail marshes, pretty much every wetland type we've got in Maine occurs along the waterway. So we also looked at climate change, and I looked at models that the state has prepared, and we kind of fine-tuned them for the Allagash, and it's pretty alarming. If anyone's paying attention to any suite of species, it's hard not to see changes. But if we stay on our current emissions trajectory, we'll be at 10-degree increase in temperature Fahrenheit by the end of the century, which means northern Maine would have a climate that's the equivalent of central Maine now by mid-century, and by like York counties by the end of the century. So what that means for all the species and ecosystems in the Allagash, you know, we're still just trying to get a handle on. And probably I guess one of the most immediate concerned is what's going to happen to the cold water systems, and especially fish, because the Allagash, you know, brook trout it's just renowned as a place to go fishing for those who like to fish for cold water fish. And already the southern part of the northern part of the river near the outlet is too warm in most summers for trout to live, but they can fortunately go up to the mouths of streams where cold water comes in or farther upstream. But the last couple of years, that has been the case. So they're a good bellwether species, and that's one of the reasons that the stream monitoring work is going on. And the changes that we've seen, that breeding bird atlas, there's now lots of turkey vultures and wild turkeys and bluebirds and indigo buntings and mourning doves and rock pigeons, a lot of species that weren't there 30 years ago. And also we saw the first painted turtle that's been documented in this part of the state, the northwestern part of the state, and it was in the southern part of the waterway. So, and they're another good weather species, obviously, because they're cold-blooded. Another thing we looked at was just overall condition of the forest. And that, to me, having spent a lot of time working in the Northwoods, is almost, well, as big a concern as climate change You can see what you could call a beauty strip along the river, and then much of the forest is being cut fairly heavily. Rotations are pretty short now, 40 to 60 years. And as a result, less than 3% of the forest in the watershed is in a late successional forest condition. And the impacts of that on diversity, I think, have to be pretty large. On water quality, it's less clear. So, the biggest takeaway for the work I did is that we have to be looking at the watershed as a whole, from the headwaters down to the river itself. The Nature Conservancy uses a phrase, the active river area, and the headwaters are actually the most important in terms of contributing material and nutrients and that kind of thing to the quality of the river. And yet our forest practices law don't address those at all. So this effort by the foundation is to try to focus attention on the bigger picture, which I think is really important. So there's a number of recommendations that are in the report, and I'll go over a few of them in hopes that just educating people to really value this place. So obviously we have to collaborate with Bureau of Parks and Lands, private agencies, other nonprofits, the Wabanaki, who this is the homeland, particularly for the Maliseet, and academics, to try to figure out how to take care of this place. And this map, just so you know, the brown areas are easements. They don't impact forest harvesting, but those are areas where there won't be development. The green is state land, and all the lighter brown is commercial forest land, and the Nature Conservancy owns the purple polygons. And in the very big picture, the Allagash is right smack in the middle of a corridor that connects the Western Main Mountains to the Gaspé Peninsula. So it's pretty key, plus the fact that it runs from north to south, spans more than a degree of latitude. It's a movement corridor for species. So it's important to think about in those terms. And it's also sandwiched between Baxter State Park. You can see Mount Katahdin in the distance there, and this is a lake in the beginning of the waterway, and also the St. John Forest that the Nature Conservancy protects. So there's another sort of east-west connection that would make a lot of sense. And we identified a lot of specific areas to try to protect for a variety of reasons. A lot of the larger streams are intact systems in and of themselves, incredibly clean and contributing cold water to the waterway. The confluence of the river, it's protected up to 6 miles from where it enters the St. John, and there's always been interest, but so far no willing landowners to protect farther towards the confluence where it makes that big S turn. Wetland and riparian buffers, our forest practices law doesn't do a great job at protecting those. You can cut trees as long as you leave shrubs, and there's concern now what that means for keeping streams cold, not to mention the variety of species that live in those wetlands. And then another big issue is the late successional forests and cedar forests. Cedar forests, I spent the first summer barefoot for the most part, just trying to find seeps where they entered the river or lakes, because they were always about 8 degrees cooler. So you could feel them immediately if you were walking. And the coldest ones came out of cedar areas, which are being cut pretty heavily right now. So trying to, again, look at the big picture and where some of these more important areas are is one of the recommendations. And cold water fish habitat in general, some streams are more important than others because of their depth or size or gradients. The Allagash Stream and Allagash Lake watershed, again, that's probably one, in my mind, the most significant lakes in the state. And there's a whole nother chain of lakes called Musquecook, 5 lakes that are undeveloped that feed into another larger stream that enters into the Allagash. And then Ellis Bog, as I mentioned before, is an important area where, unfortunately, like the buffers right up to the bog are being cut, even if it's a part of the bog, but if it's wooded, it's being cut. So thinking about forest management is important. If you look at this photo, you may not be able to tell, but it's a pretty young forest. And, I think the general ecological thinking is the more diverse the forest in terms of age classes and habitats, the more resilient the forest will be to climate change. And we also are recommending that an ecologist be hired. Right now, there's a lot of rangers that manage the recreational side of, and also some of the forest management that you can see from the waterway. But there's no ecologist on staff, which I think is hugely important to start to pay attention to things like invasive species or monitoring some of the impacts of climate change and other things. And there were still a lot of things we couldn't get to, and in inventorying vernal pools, fishless ponds, other rare plant and animal habitats. Visiting one area once during a field season is not obviously going to cover all the things that are there. And then invasive species, we found, I think it was 6 species, including purple loosestrife, and we don't really know if it can expand to the point where it really affects the system or will be kept in check just by the dynamics of the watershed. But obviously it's time for someone to be on the ground, and that's one of the things the foundation is planning to do and fund. And then the long-term monitoring that began with stream monitors is going to continue for several more years and hopefully beyond that, but to get a baseline and then a handle for trends on water temperature. And then one of the last things that will come of this is this was a guide that focused on history, but a similar one that focuses on ecology that people can carry with them when they're in the waterway is another goal. So the path forward, I will say just a few words about the foundation, which I am working for, but I'm not part of. But they are well on their way to implementing some of these recommendations, like that handbook is in the process of being written. The stream temperature monitoring, they're looking at ways to extend that. We've talked about hiring an ecologist. We're looking at late successional forests, and we've already figured out where they are, and hopefully we'll be working with landowners to try to protect some of those. They're working on something called climate smart forestry, exemplary forest management, trying to look at carbon as a potential way to manage the forest more lightly. So there's a whole lot of projects underfoot, which is pretty exciting. And I will say the foundation has a really good relationship with the Bureau of Parks and Lands. But in my view, our work's just beginning. The trip I took 2 weeks ago was with members of 3 of the Wabanaki communities in the state, and they look at this completely differently. And that was an eye-opener for me. They're not focused on natural communities. They're focusing on what plants or animals impact their culture and have been for millennia and will going forward. And that's what they view. They're not looking at aesthetics or adrenaline or aerobics. They're really focused on what things matter to their communities. And that's another relationship that the foundation is beginning to build right now. So it's a remarkable place. I hope if you haven't been there that you'll pay attention to what is happening up there. I feel like one thing I didn't mention, it's the least developed, has no watershed in the state, we think probably east of the Rockies. It has no towns, no public roads, no mining, no agriculture, and it's the only watershed like that. So it's a really special place, and I hope this will pique your interest. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet.
You're welcome.
And I would just remind everybody to put your questions in the chat. And while we're waiting for questions, I can say that we at the Allagash Wilderness Waterway Foundation had some very productive conversations with a landowner who owns about 1/3 of that 1.1 million acres. And we were on the cusp of a major pilot project, but we're unable to get it across the finish line this time around. For funding through the U.S. Forest, through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. Forest Service, for essentially a climate smart, lowercase CS, climate smart forestry. And we're hoping, and if you're wondering, that means let the trees grow bigger. And That's the shorthand of climate smart forestry. And we're hoping that we might be able to pull that off the next funding round. I've got a question from Francesca Holland. Are there opportunities for volunteering?
Well, the foundation can answer that. I think there will be, and I'm within the waterway itself for Bureau of Parks and Lands. They definitely welcome volunteers doing.
Yeah, and I'll chime in and say, yes, I think if we can get, we're hoping to be able to get to fund a specialist to develop an invasive species monitoring plan for the waterway. It'll probably take a season to flesh that out. And then once that plan is developed and in the hands of the Bureau of Public Lands in Maine, and we'll be able to have a place for volunteers to help out.
And that
How
could take.
do people who are passionate about the Allagash get involved? I probably you shouldn't have asked me to do this, Melissa. You can go to our website, awwf.org. That's as much as I'll say. Beware, we'll ask you for money. Does the Furbish lousewort grow there, Janet?
Not that we're aware of, but I'd love to spend a week on the last 6 miles of the waterway.
Yeah,
it's in the St. John near the outlet, but
I'm pretty sure it's in the last 5 miles of the waterway. And I should add, just to pique your interest, everyone, a longtime senator from the region is in conversations with Irving, who owns most of that land at the end of the waterway. He's been in conversations with him for about a decade. And we're hoping eventually, before he hangs up his skates, that we can add 5 more miles to the waterway to bring the waterway right to the town of Allagash. The reason that it's 6 miles upstream is that was the site of a proposed dam back in the early 1960s. And when the waterway was created as a way to protect the Allagash, it had to end where that proposed dam was to be built. Never built, but that's why the waterway ends where it ends. There was Japanese knotweed one of the 6 invasive species?
No, but it is in the region. The one that I'm most concerned about is Phragmites, which was observed along a road in the waterway. But so far, no knotweed.
Lisa asks, what are the most interesting plant communities along the waterway?
Well, if you like rare things, riverside seeps, they're called, where cold water is coming out of those scoured shores, have a number of rare plants like that glaucous rattlesnake root, and then Tophelia glutinose, I think that's called something else now. Grassa parnassus, shrubby cinquefoil, a whole suite of species that aren't found elsewhere. And then those circumneutral river shores as well have a lot of rare plant species. But in my mind, the most interesting are just the constantly shifting mosaics on the deltas, where there's fens and alder shrub, marshes and willows, and just all beaver flowages, a lot of things happening there.
Are any of these communities state protected?
If they're in an ecological reserve, they are. Like there's some I found an old stand of northern hardwood and hemlock. The hemlock was 330 years old, and that's in an ecological reserve. But the wetland communities, we have a zoning classification, significant wetland and wading bird habitat, or wading and wetland waterfowl habitat, that does protect them to some extent. That doesn't mean you can't cut the buffers. So there's some protection for a lot of them, but not all.
An interesting question from Russ Cohen. Are any of the plant species documented there believed to be introduced to the watershed by indigenous people? Bur oak, for example.
Well, there is no bur oak there, but I had a really interesting conversation with a woman named Suzanne Greenlaw when I was on my trip about the possibility of likelihood in her mind that fire was used to manage for canoe birch. That's one of we don't know what Allagash means. We know so little about Allagash or indigenous use of the waterway, although it was everywhere. There's evidence of it everywhere. Beyond that, I'm sure when we were paddling, they were looking at black ash, obviously, and medicinal species. So I think there's quite a bit that would be used.
Did you look at fungi?
We did not. I mean, no. Again, it was a time, and also I don't have the expertise, but yet another thing that should be looked at, particularly, and my biggest concern about the forestry management situation up there is things like lichens on trees, fungi, that likes coarse woody debris, mosses don't have time to become established before the next cut, and often the canopy doesn't close. So things are changing pretty quickly, and the question is, are there enough source areas and ways for them to move between those left?
Yeah, and I should just add that was part of the focus of our effort to try to get some funds from the U.S. Forest Service to pilot a exemplary forestry project, and maybe we'll be able to do that in the next round. A question is asked: is there a role for NEBS to help with fine filter documentation of plant diversity?
Boy, there's a place for volunteers. If you like to canoe, I'll go with you. And there's some areas that it would be nice to have a lot more time, to really see what's there. And the other thing that never happened with the Allagash that's happened for Baxter is a look at historical records in herbaria. The Allagash wasn't nearly as accessible as Baxter was. But I'm guessing it might be interesting to see those records and what used to be there. So it does seem like there might be a role. Think about what that might be would be interesting.
Great. Well, just as a teaser to everybody online, we're likely to have a gathering in October at the Coastal Maine Botanical Garden of the New England Botanical Society, looking at plant conservation writ large. And so maybe we'll invite Janet and see if we can find some paddle buddies for you, Janet. I'm not seeing any additional questions. And so once more, again, Janet, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us tonight. It's been great to get this overview, and especially important for me to share a very special place in my heart with my friends in the New England Botanical Society, the Allagash Wilderness Waterway.